Okay, this is Dennis. I want to welcome everybody to tonight's fireside chat with Lyndon LaRouche for Thursday, July 6th. We're going to be discussing the process that we're engaged in leading up to August 6th. There will be a rally at the United Nations, which we will be participating in. And the rally is being sponsored by and organized by a kind of coalition formation called Humanity for Peace. Now, the idea is that some of us have, on the basis of having thought through for about a month the implications of a speech given on June 10th, 1963 by John F. Kennedy at Georgetown University, and thinking about what he had to say in that speech, we're wondering in what way we can replicate the spirit of that speech, not in a speech, but in a set of actions that are taken by people from all over the world that try to extricate the transatlantic sector from its collapse and crisis in leadership. That is, that if you have the misfortune to read things like the New York Times, you try to make sense out of the world of a Joe Biden or the world of people like the former mayors and present mayor of New York City or others. You find that you're sort of confronted by persons that are so below the level of events, so unable to act, to prepare the people of their respective nations, be that France, Germany, Italy, the United States, Great Britain, prepare the people of those nations for what the immediate present requires of them and the immediate future requires of them. That the human race at this rate will confront its greatest crisis and is in danger of losing that fight for humanity. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to remind the human race of its humanity in the transatlantic sector. People in China, in Russia, or in various of the nations like Brazil or South Africa, at least the leadership of those nations, don't have to be reminded about the importance of humanity and the idea that you have to provide for the international security of all of humanity in order to be assured that the world will not plunge into the abyss and accidentally or deliberately eliminate all of human civilization in the course of a few hours. That's been the necessary circumstance we've lived in since 1945. The war that has erupted in Ukraine is more of the variety of a disease. It's sort of like the virus is self-destruction itself. And various Russian officials who refer to this as hybrid war have begun discussing this in somewhat different terms than they normally had. For example, Dmitry Medvedev, who was previously the president of Russia for a period of time and is presently one of the three people coordinating the special military operation from the standpoint of the logistics and the production end, talked about the war a few days ago, and he said that the confrontation that's going on involving Russia, China, Brazil, and others on one hand, and various members of the transatlantic sector on the other, that it stems from diametrically opposed views on the further development of mankind. That's actually a quote from him. Diametrically opposed views on the further development of mankind. He said, the hybrid war they are waging on us is their last chance to maintain the advantageous status quo, advantageous for them, to keep their weakened power and influence. These are countries, they're talking about the emerging countries, what's sometimes called the global south. But what you're really talking about are the countries of Africa, Asia, and South America, many of which are not actually in the southern hemisphere, but that's what's actually being referenced. When Medvedev talked about it here, he said, these are countries which continue to gain momentum, gradually overcoming the economic and political aftermath of their colonial past. They stand for equal development of all states. Without senior and minor partners, he needs major and minor partners, without the cynical division into historically developed and underdeveloped countries, without the division into true democracies and authoritarian regimes. So what he's saying is that a process that the United States itself came out of, namely the colonization process in which it was from roughly 1619, 1620, or say 1607 until 1776, under the heel and under the thumb of a British colonial enterprise, which varied in its quality of leadership from time to time, but ultimately would have been the undoing of the productive economies that were being built in the American colonies, which in effect were becoming sovereign and independent. While it goes beyond our ability to discuss this now, even slavery, as we are taught that it existed, was challenged in Virginia, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, to the Crown. They petitioned the Crown to end slavery. And they wanted to end slavery. This is now the 1660s, 70s. They wanted to end it because they recognized that the character of slave labor made it impossible for them to actually take advantage of the great richness of the Virginian soil and circumstance. They wanted to be able to have free, independent, productive labor. And the British Parliament let them know on two separate occasions that should they actually stray into such an area, that the very idea that they would talk about that was a casus belli. And so although Virginia twice sought to abolish slavery, they were prevented from doing so before the year 1700 by the British Empire. This is important to state because actually the British got worse after the accession of the East India Company, and that came about in 1763. And that led, over the course of a 13-year period, to an unavoidable conflict with what became the United States of America, as we celebrated that only a couple of days ago. Now, the United States today confronts a circumstance which is far more dire than any that it has actually been in, probably including the Second World War. And that's a circumstance in which it appears to lack self-conscious leadership capable of any longer recognizing that a lapse of judgment of the type that is characteristic of the entire ensemble of U.S. foreign policy right now could abruptly lead to thermonuclear war. And that's just the nature of the nuclear sword of Damocles that's been hanging over humanity ever since the United States elected to drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and also Nagasaki. That did not have to be done, but it was done. And since the time that was done, the sword of a thermonuclear end of humanity has hung over the human race. Now, what we're going to do in 4.5 weeks is we are going to be part of the conducting of a demonstration and rally at the United Nations. There will be other events that will be part of that. And we are going to be doing this as a way of, on the one hand, calling for kind of a world atonement for the use of the atomic bomb. But more importantly, we want to use it as the occasion to put forward our best ideas about a new security and development architecture. One element of that certainly is food. Clearly, if you don't have and cannot provide clean food, water and nutritious food for any section of the human race, then everything else comes apart. Back in 1988, Lyndon LaRouche formed an organization, which is part of basically the Schiller Institute, called Food for Peace. He wasn't the first person to talk that way. That was something that had been discussed in the Kennedy administration and even in the Eisenhower administration. But when Lyndon LaRouche put this forward, it was 1 month after his successful Kempinski Hotel Columbus Day speech, in which he forecast that Berlin would become the capital of a new unified Germany. And he put forward a proposal involving the joint economic development of Poland, in which the United States and the Soviet Union will work together, very much in the spirit of what JFK called for 60 years ago, this September 20th, when he called for a joint Soviet-U.S. mission to the moon, which would allow the two countries to spend less, to consolidate their costs, and to take a step toward a new world and a new form of stability in the world. Well, that didn't occur. The president was assassinated. The plan was abandoned. But what we are called upon to do right now is to pursue, in the form of, for example, in the case of Xi Jinping, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilizational Initiative. Well, if you're going to have a global security initiative, you've got to have food. Food is essential to security. And that is what tonight is we wish to present. That's the subject of tonight. I'm going to present this topic so that as we do the organizing going into that August 6th date, which is a Sunday, by the way, and the rally will be in the afternoon at the United Nations, probably starting at 1 o'clock going until 4. And the notion is, what is the positive side? What is it we are saying we want to replace the present unfunctioning world order with? Exactly what are we saying we would do that's different and better than what is going on as it is? So for tonight's purposes, Bob Baker from the Agricultural Desk of Executive Intelligence Review, and who's been around a long time and worked with a long time as an associate of Lyndon LaRouche, has assembled a group of farm leaders who are going to talk to us about this, and then we'll go to questions and answers if we have such after their presentations. And so, Bob, you now have the floor. Go right ahead and start.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dennis. I appreciate that and your introduction to put this into focus. So the major thing starting right off is everyone on this call ought to be excited and have a certain feeling of success because we are here. In other words, the LaRouche organization and all the various things that we've worked with for the last 42 years, no organization has taken more political hits and survived than we have. And we have fought consistently for what is known internationally and historically as the American system of economics. And that means you have a strong agriculture and an industrial base that's anchored to science and the ideas of developing in agriculture the highest sciences of the soil, of how to unlock the secrets of food production and increase the food production in such a way so that you have no problem feeding the populations of every nation and being self-sufficient. Now, the thing that has happened is, because over all these years, probably at least currently, nobody has really identified or put out, what we're up against. Because in all the different groups, whether it's agriculture, industry, engineering, machinery, people have certain particular issues that they're fighting for or they're trying to change, to improve, to what? In order to make a living so they can support their families and support their parents and elderly in a dignified human way. Now, our founding fathers knew that we were up against a particular type of system in the world. And that's one of the reasons we actually ended up with a republic. And what we now have to do is what Benjamin Franklin said, you got to fight to save the republic. And I want to read, just in order to set this tone, from a book called The Harmony of Interest by Henry C. Carey, C-A-R-E-Y. He was the economics advisor to Abraham Lincoln. His father was collaborators with Benjamin Franklin, and they were the family that printed the books about the American system and distributed them all over the world. And in the last chapter of his book, he has 3 pages. He summarizes things, and I'm just going to read a couple quotes. He says, 2 systems are before the world. The one looks to increasing the proportion of persons and of capital engaged in trade and transportation, and therefore it diminishes the proportion engaged in producing commodities with which to trade, with necessarily diminished returns to the labor of all, while the other system looks to increasing the proportion engaged in the work of production and diminishing that engaged in trade and transportation, with increased return to all, giving the labor good wages and to the owner of capital good profits. One looks to increasing the quantity of raw materials to be exported and diminishing the inducements to the import of men, thus impoverishing both farmer and planter by throwing on them the burden of freight, while the other looks to increasing the importation of men, slavery, and diminishing the export of raw materials, therefore enriching both the planter and the farmer by relieving them from the payment of freight. Now, they sum it up by saying, to establish such an empire, to prove that among the people of the world, whether agriculturalists, manufacturers, or merchants, there is a perfect harmony of interests, that the happiness of individuals as well as the grandeur of nations is to be promoted by perfect obedience to that greatest of all commands. Do unto others as ye would that others should do unto you. This is the object and will be the result of the mission. And if, on the contrary, they be governed by that ignorant selfishness which leads to the belief that individuals, party, and national interests are to be promoted by measures trending to the deterioration of the condition of others, then we will have war and poverty. Now, there's more, but I wanted to set that tone in this discussion because this is a discussion about food production, about agriculture, and what does that mean? And it's much more than markets. It's much more than, the survival of the fittest and everybody fighting each other and somehow we get a market price. No, we need a market price that's going to make to provide a living standard at the highest level for the families involved in agriculture, whether it's the actual planting of the seeds and the livestock or the machinery it takes to put this together, schools and the education, because everybody throughout society needs to have a cultural orientation, not to fight each other, but to work together and get a sustenance in such a way they can live dignified and move the cultural level of everybody to a higher and higher level each year, thus increasing the creative potential of society. And there's no way to have joy without being creative. You can have a lot of yucks and laughs, but to find real joy, you must be creative. And that's one reason a lot of farmers will work day and night their whole life in order to barely hang on, because the joy of the creative process is tremendous. Now, what we're seeing across the nation, we're seeing the shutdown of our farms. We're seeing the consolidation of land and food production into big and bigger and bigger types of processes. Some people call it industrial farming. But we're seeing it all over the world. We're seeing it in Europe. And so here we are in this process. And we're watching the consolidation of food production into bigger and bigger operations. And at the same time, everyone is still being squeezed because the margins are so thin, even though they maybe produce more. But the biggest thing is this, what I read. There's two systems in the world. And the one is modeled after what we fought a revolution to get rid of, called the old East India system, British East India, Dutch East India, and those systems were all put together. They set up the first global corporations, and as they got bigger and bigger, they set in motion a process to control islands, control countries, and an example is what the Dutch and British East India Company did, moving into the Asian world. And, these guys had whole clusters of monopolies. That's what we fought a revolution to get rid of. The British Empire was about 600 monopolies. And they were given the power, basically, to treat people like animals. And they went into countries, and I'll just focus on India and China in particular, but they went into all those every country islands, and they would go in and they would get the farmers and the people there organized to grow food for them so they could ship it out. And they would leave them basically next to nothing. Then, they built their own private armies. So these big multinational corporations, they had private armies. And they were given the right to go in and police the colonies which they took over. They were also moved in, as people know. They've heard of the Opium Wars in India and China, and how the British Empire organized their military. When the Chinese pushed back, they didn't want the opium. They invaded them and the British, the colonies, through the British East India corporations, the multinational monopolies, they push in the drugs and basically control countries through finance, drugs, and basically ripping off their production in such a way that they couldn't accumulate what it took to build up their society for their people. Now, you might have just heard in the news, which country is the largest consumer of drugs in the world? The United States. Which country now over the last period has been involved in wars all over the world? And currently we're sending billions of dollars into the Ukraine, where the best farmland in the world is, and into a country that is very high tech, very educated on the sciences, and just supporting this process. Well, we saw that in Iraq. We see it in Afghanistan. We see it, guess where? Right here in our nation. Number one drug consumer in the world. We have our lifespan is reduced, is going down. And situation after situation that we used to pride ourselves on. So we are being affected by the two systems before the world. And we're now in the clutches of what we fought a revolution to get rid of. Now, the question is, if you was to sit back and watch all of this like it's some kind of a sports game, like most of the news media got people doing, it's like people are sitting in the bleachers, watching their smartphone, and not looking at the game of these two systems that are fighting it out in the world. And the systems that we're talking about is the American system of economics, which LaRouche and our organization, I don't think you'll find another organization that can more explain this in the way necessary so that it actually becomes something you want to be a part of your identity. And also that American system is against the old empire system that is now what the farmers in the Netherlands are protesting, the farmers in Germany, the farmers in France, the farmers in Spain, on and on and on, and even right here in this country. And the key is to focus on what is at the top of all this that is affecting everybody. Two systems are at war, and you've got to understand the policies of economics and the cultural outlook and the types of outlooks that each has towards human beings who are created in the image of God. And that is what we need to develop and nurture, is that creative potential with love of your neighbor. And that is what we, through periods in our country, you can see in rural agriculture, family farmers work together, the families, they help each other out, they share the tough times and the bad times. But today it has shifted into the market forces of the old empire type thinking, where now we got global corporations that are just growing in leaps and bounds, and they are sewing up control of food and many other things. And the good thing is we're having this discussion. And the LaRouche organization and what we represent and what we have, are building our youth movement and spreading out across the country has the solution to that. So I'd like to just sort of leave that thought as a lunge here in the beginning of this discussion. And we got Ron Wyzorek and Mike Calicrate on. Ron's a farm leader out in South Dakota in that area. Mike is a farm leader in Kansas and Colorado and all over throughout the nation, actually, because of what we stand for. So I'd like to ask Mike to open up your mic and make some comments about what you see in terms of, like, we were talking today, the different types of meat facilities that we need to get back to versus big mega controllers of our food that are just jacking up the price to the consumers and really squeezing the producers so they can't make it. Mike, are you got your unmute opened up? I guess not.
Mike, comment if Mike is not available.
Yes, go right ahead.
Well, I would just wanted to back up what Dennis opened up with, and that was we have to overcome this leadership crisis that we're facing. And when I look back at, my family, my great-grandchildren are eighth-generation South Dakotans. And that's how long we've been in the state of South Dakota before it was even a state. And I would like to just recall some of the history of what the agriculture has gone through in the past 75 years or longer. And that's coming out of World War II with a parity farming system that pegged parity prices for the farm commodities and industrial labor at a rate where you can make a living. One job would produce a living for a family. That is something that we have to get back to. Our economy has to be focused on that, and also the ability of producing. That's where wealth comes from. New ideas, new technologies. And we cannot continue this fighting over the bits and pieces of a stagnant society that they are trying to dump on us today. And Bob hits it right on the head when he talks about the British free trade system. When people are competing against each other over the bits and pieces rather than producing, all you can expect is not harmony, but strife and suffering. And that's what we're looking at in the United States today. I mean, we look at 80% of the farm bill now goes to feeding the poor or to the food program to feed the poor in the supposedly richest country in the world. Somebody's insane if they can accept that. And again, back to looking at what happened, in the 30s when the farmers were put off the farm. I think today we're looking at a worse crisis facing us and a worse hunger crisis than that affected this country in the 30s. And it was only through the efforts of a change in the policies going back to what Bob was saying with Henry Carey. I mean, Lincoln used Henry Carey. Garfield was a Carey man. William Warfield was a Carey man, and he created the largest industrial giant the world ever seen at the turn of the 1900s. Or at the turn of the 1900s. And then we look at basically the free trade system taking over the next 20 years and looking at the blowout after World War II in a war that we should have never been in, and looking at inflated land prices and collapsing commodity prices after the war, where we saw more farmers put off the farm in South Dakota and the Midwest here in 1925 than any year in the 30s. It wasn't the drought that destroyed the farmers, it was the economic policies. And then when we had the blowout on Wall Street in 29, why some of the great Republicans in South Dakota worked to do an investigation into what had caused the crisis on Wall Street. Peter Norbeck, the head of the Senate Banking Commission, hiring Ferdinand Picaro, doing a total investigation of the crooks on Wall Street, putting some of those in jail. Many of them, when the Attorney General's office knocked on the door, went to the highest window and jumped out. And today, these guys that are doing the same thing are getting patted on the back and giant bonuses. What happened to the morality of the American people? How do they tolerate what is going on in this country? And I think the only way out is to look at what Roosevelt done, with a parity pricing system, with Glass-Steagall, and in 1944 and 1945, New Bretton Woods. And those are basically the same principles that Lyndon and Helga LaRouche have taken and added to with their 4 laws and their 10 and Helga's latest statements on the 10 principles. And that's the only way we're going to get out of this mess. And going back again to the 30s, we can look at the parity price system and the government development of technology and industries prior or right after we got, or up to the point where we got into World War II in 39, and then in 41 when we actually got into the fighting. I mean, we were a nation that after World War II basically rebuilt all of Europe, helped rebuild Russia, helped build Japan, the Philippines, Northern Africa. And today we spend all our money on bombing people rather than building. And we've got to get back to that development process, or I mean, what is facing us right now is something worse than we've ever seen in the fallout in the 80s and the 87 crisis and the 33 crisis and the crisis of 1887 and you can go back to right after Alexander Hamilton, the collapse in the country, and when we had to get back to the principles of Carey. And I mean, I can't stress to people reading what Bob read to you from Carey and reading that book, The Harmony of Interest. I've got several of those in my shelf, and I every once in a while I pull it out and read it again. I'm not the best speaker in the world, but I tell you what, I know right from wrong, and that's more important than being a fancy talker like we've got in Washington today. I mean, some of those idiots we got up there, I don't know how in the world they ever got up there. My grandparents in their overalls would have never tolerated anything like we're looking at today. And maybe I'm getting a little carried away here. I better turn it back to Bob.
There is one thing I want to say to everybody in terms of what the context is of the whole conversation we're having. You may remember that there was a period where Ukraine and Russia had negotiated a grain deal. And the concept was that they were going to be able to jointly work together. This was mediated by Turkey at the time. And the notion was you're going to free up Ukraine grain and Russian grain so that developing nations in particular could still have adequate food supply. What happened was that only the Ukrainian grain was actually allowed to be shipped, and the Ukrainian grain was essentially all shipped into, in one way or the other, either Europe or other sectors of that same variety. About 4% of it went to South America, well, mainly to Africa or to any of the countries that were actually would need it. Now that shows you the issue of food and the issue of a free and independent owner-operated agriculture, where that means family-owned and operated agriculture, is decisive. And in addition, when you look at this issue of climate change and so on, you've seen in Netherlands and you've seen in some other areas demonstrations that are not merely talking about questions of lack of justice toward farmers or something, but these have taken up major central questions concerning international strategy. I just wanted to reference this because I see there's a couple people in the queue, and again, just so it's clear what we're up to, is that we have a kind of a countdown already going into, we're approximately 40 days, not quite, I guess, away from August 6th when the atomic bomb was dropped. You figure if today is the 6th, you've got 25 days left in this month now, and you have 5 days remaining, so 30 days. And so what we're doing is we are converging upon the United Nations. We have a couple of different calls that people have seen. Helga LaRouche has a call for the future president of the United States to adopt the outlook that Kennedy had, that's talked about in his American University speech on the question of peace. And that is to see your adversary as being a human being. Clearly, when you're talking about feeding the world, you see people as human beings. And so what will happen here is I'm going to go and I'm going to ask, let me first of all see, is there anyone else from the farm leadership that has anything to say? Otherwise, I've got a couple of questions in the queue, and we can have people take questions if that's what we want to do. Does anybody else?
Hey, this is Mike Calicray. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, hi, Mike. Very good. We were looking for you before.
Hey, sorry, I didn't punch in the additional numbers to be able to not get out of muted, to be muted. But I just wanted to say I agree with what has been said, and I think we've made a full return back to that revolutionary period in the East India Company and British Crown. I think now, though, that the corporations are really in that position of power, and in combination with their power with governments around the world, I mean, they make the East India Company look, pretty minor. And as Ron Bazurek was saying, these corporations of 250 or so years ago had their own private militaries. Well, the corporations today also have their own private military. It's called the U.S. military. I mean, and they basically own the government. They control the government. And the more pressure we apply to try to break that stranglehold and get back to where we can feed ourselves again with family farms and restore some income back to the farm and ranch gate, the harder we work for that, the more pressure we face. And we've never had corporations like JBS and Cargill and Tyson that have been so big and powerful globally that they're essentially stronger and bigger than our own governments. And so, you look at the hearings, the recent hearings in D.C., the judiciary hearing of a couple weeks ago, and all you see is a bunch of bantering back and forth between the Republicans and the Democrats, and we're going nowhere. And I just don't see how we're going to ever get to the point where we get our government back again without the citizenry, realizing that instead of searching for the cheapest of everything, that they now start to become citizens again and taking some responsibility for the politics that we have. And of course, I love the principles of Kerry around connecting the consumer closer to the producer and cutting out the middlemen and all of that. And so, I've just decided that I'm going to go home and I'm going to build the best economy I can, mostly just around food. Wealth is created from the soil, yet we allow the corporations to steal that wealth, leaving, crumbs behind that we fight over. And so I just think we've somehow got to figure out how to maybe the Dutch are going to show us some grit, I guess, like Bob would say, to take our governments back again and make them work for the people. But I see that as a real challenge ahead. So yeah, I just think we're being ruled by corporations. Cargill controls the grain in Ukraine. We're all serving, the interests of corporations today. And for myself, I plan to keep working on building that system where they're not part of my life. So thank you.